Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our fellowships panel from Pipe Dream to Project in Action. This is where we bring in folks from graduate fellowship agencies, as well as the fellows who are doing the work with their project to talk about how to create a project, how to apply, how to talk to an agency, designing and implementing that project. So we are very excited to have Brooke Meckler, who's the Director of Law School Engagement and Advocacy at Equal Justice Works, Kathleen Rubenstein, who's the Executive Director of Skadden Fellowship Foundation, Karla Olivas, who's the Equal Justice Works Fellow at the National Immigrant Justice Center, and Emily Wilson, who's a Skadden Fellow and Staff Attorney at Equip for Equality. And so just starting with Brooke and then Kathleen, why don't you both introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your organization.
Sure, thank you, Brent. Thank you for having me, and it's good to see everyone. My name, again, is Brooke Meckler. I'm the Director of the Law School Engagement and Advocacy Unit, it's such a mouthful, at Equal Justice Works. And if you're unfamiliar with our organization, we're a nonprofit. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C., but we partner with legal aid organizations and funders all across the country to facilitate opportunities that allow law students and lawyers to really pursue their passion for public interest through sort of a lifelong career that serves that purpose. So we have a lot of different opportunities for students to get involved with public interest law. We have student fellowship programs. We also have other student engagement initiatives to help you really pursue a career. We have an annual conference and career fair every year where you can hear from really amazing public interest leaders, as well as apply for and interview for employers outside of the Equal Justice Works organization. And then, of course, we have postgraduate fellowships. The one we're probably most known for is the opportunity for you to design your own fellowship project, which is what I will mostly be focusing on today.
Perfect. Kathleen, tell us a little bit more about Skadden.
Hi, so similar to Brooke and EJW, Skadden runs a project-based fellowship where you are applying to us having already secured for yourself a host organization and designed a project proposal. And then we fund the first 2 years of your legal career with the goal of really launching your public interest career. We're in our 33rd class that we'll be selecting this year. And so we are a community of 906 current, former, and incoming fellows. I started my career as a fellow, and the community that we create is something that we tend to support. So once a fellow, always a fellow. And excited to talk to you today about your thinking thus far and getting ready for a proposal in September.
Perfect. And then we have Karla and Emily. So Karla, let's start with you. Introduce yourself briefly. Tell us a little bit about your project and why you chose to pursue a fellowship.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I graduated from law school, Iowa Law, in May 2020. I am an Equal Justice Works fellow. I'm one of the fellows that designed my own fellowship, as Brooke was mentioning. And my host organization, the organization I work for, is called National Immigrant Justice Center. My sponsor, the firm that funds my fellowship, is Greenberg Traurig. They're headquartered here in Chicago as well. And my fellowship focuses on challenging prolonged detention for immigration detainees and delayed immigration applications for immigrants in U.S. district courts. So a lot of my work so far has been mainly litigation-based and working with a handful of pro bono attorneys and associates who are partnering with me on these cases.
Great. And Emily, tell us a little bit about yourself and your project.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily. Thank you so much for having me here today. So I graduated in May 2020, like Karla, from William & Mary Law School, and I'm in my first year of my Skadden Fellowship. My host organization is Equip for Equality. So I work in the special education clinic at Equip for Equality, and my project is focused on transition age students. So under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, students are entitled to a free and appropriate public education. And specifically when students get older, when they're 14 and a half to 22, the school should engage in what we call transition planning. So supporting them, supporting the students in preparing for post-secondary education, job training, independent living. And so my focus is to provide direct representation to students and families who fall into that category, that transition age, and making sure that they're getting those transition services to really be prepared for life after high school and to improve outcomes for individuals with disabilities as they move beyond public education.
Great. And so, as normal, I have a bunch of questions, but we want to hear from you. We want to make sure that we're answering the questions that you all have for our panelists. So, you know, brainstorm. We'll hear from them a little bit, and then you know, chat me. Let me know that you have a question that you want to ask, and either I'm happy to ask it, or I'd love for you all to turn on your video and you can ask it yourself. So be thinking about a question, and we'd be happy to and excited to hear from you. So Brooke and Kathleen, let's start with you again. Tell us a little bit more about the parameters of your fellowship program. What are the typical timelines for the application process, and what do you look for in an applicant? Brooke, do you want to take this one first? Yeah, sorry.
Sure. So with the Equal Justice Works Fellowship, and Kathleen described this with the Skadden Fellowship as well, but this is your opportunity to really connect with and host organization before you apply for the project itself. So you've already determined what your project will focus on. Your organization is really promising to host you throughout the 2 years of your fellowship. And what you're doing with an Equal Justice Works Fellowship is really filling a gap in services that an organization would not have been able to do if not for your project, and would not be able to serve or expand their services in that community if not for your project. So in order to do that, you have to partner with a nonprofit, so a 501c3, it could be a legal aid organization or an organization that has a lot of different services, legal services being one of them. We typically have recent graduates apply for this program. So the timeline that you'll expect every year is that in June is when the application opens, and we usually promote it to Rising 3L, so that you're applying for the program when you're in your third year of law school, with the assumption that you're going through that third year of law school, going through the interview process. You'll know you're selected as a fellow, go take the bar exam, and then start your fellowship up that next September. So our applications are due every September, and after that time, that's when we start showing all of these applications to our very generous sponsors. So the way that Equal Justice Works Fellowship is funded is that we have very generous law firms and foundations, sometimes individual donors, companies, corporations who help fund all of our fellowships. And each one of them might have a certain preference or a certain issue area that they'd really like to see addressed with the 2-year fellowship. And what we do once you've submitted your application is really show that to everyone who might be interested in funding it, which means that you might have a couple of different interviews throughout this process because there are so many sponsors interested in sponsoring the application that you've submitted. And because they are all in such separate parts of the world and care about different issue areas, that process may take a month depending on what application you've submitted, or it could take a few months. So usually we have between November and March of every year where we're going through the interview and the selection process for our fellows. And by March or April, we have all of our fellows selected, which means that you'll know that you have your fellowship set up for after you graduate, and again, go out into the field at that September.
Great. And Kathleen, tell us a little bit more about Skadden.
Absolutely. So a lot is similar, and a lot of folks put together 2 applications describing one project to the 2 of us. It's totally doable. It does take some pre-planning because the questions are a little bit different and they're due close to the same time period. So you do have to leave yourself enough time. So I'm glad we're talking now because you can hit the ground running if you're not already started. If you're a Rising 3L right now and you're going to be applying in the fall of your 3L year, our deadline will be Friday, September 10th. If you are currently a 1L Rising 2L, or if you plan on clerking, you can apply from another year out. For us, it has to be your first job. So a clerkship or an LLM is totally fine, but you have to apply from law school or one of those. And so our process moves really, really quickly. We're a little bit smaller. We fund about 28 fellows a class. So you apply to us on September 10th. And then we let you know in 2 weeks if you're going to have an interview. We're not able to interview everyone that applies. We do about 100 interviews over the course of the first half of October. And then we meet at the end of that, and every interview, I'll be there, and one of the members of our advisory committee who are partners at Skadden, who are deeply involved in pro bono and nonprofit boards and deeply involved in the foundation. We meet again as a group at the end of the interviews, and we identify 56 finalists. And then we bring those to our board of selection trustees. They meet this year on November 10th. So all of the finalists will let you know either way. First, if you're a finalist, and then if you're a finalist, we'll let you know if you're a fellow on November 11th. So we move really quickly because we know that we don't get to fund lots of amazing people and want to make sure you have bites at these other deadlines that come on later. So the timeline for us is constrained. And then same thing, you graduate law school, you take the bar exam, you move if you're not in the same geography, and then you go ahead and start over the course of the fall, whenever works for you and your host organization. And then what we look for in fellows, the Skadden Fellowships need to address the civil legal needs of people living in poverty in the US. And you can see something about all 906 of us on our website. So you can see this huge variety of needs. The two topics we're talking about today, immigration and kids, huge topics, but there are dozens and dozens more. So the sky is really the limit. Just a note there, we don't fund criminal representation. And one small area we don't fund is we don't fund civil projects for adults who are detained in the criminal legal system. The contours of all of this, I'm always happy to discuss one-on-one. And also I'll put my contact information in the chat.
Perfect. And now, Karla and Emily, can you tell us a little bit more? Let's go back to when you were in law school and maybe you had heard about Equal Justice Works in Skadden. And then how did you research prospective host organizations? How did you think about a project and start developing that proposal? Karla, let's start again with you and then go to Emily for that.
Sure. So before I went to law school, I went to undergrad in El Paso, Texas, right along the border. And when I was an undergrad, I worked for an emergency domestic violence shelter. I worked the graveyard shifts on the weekends, really awful. I had clients who had really awful experiences. And then I later on worked for an immigration nonprofit and did intakes at the El Paso Detention Center. And I knew going into law school that I wanted to do public interest work, and then I wanted to do immigration sort of work. But I also knew that I didn't want to do the same kind of direct services that I had done during undergrad. I didn't want to, even though I knew I wanted immigrants to be my clients, I didn't want to be the ones taking on their asylum applications or defending them in immigration court or anything like that. So when I started to look for jobs during my summers in law school, I tried really hard to find jobs where my clients were immigrants, but I was doing more impact sort of work or bigger picture kind of work. So my first year I clerked for a magistrate judge in the Southern District of Iowa. And then my second year, ironically, I ended up working for a nonprofit in DC doing direct immigration services. I had represented a couple people in immigration court, and it was a really great experience. And that was my 2L summer. And I was kind of freaking out because I knew I was man, I really don't, it was really meaningful work, but this isn't what I want to do long term. So when I was in DC, I busted my butt and I hustled a lot to go to a bunch of networking events and meet as many people as I could. And I already knew that EJW and Skadden fellowships were a thing. I just didn't have a nonprofit organization that I knew to approach or anything like that to apply together. Because at least the way EJW works is you find a host organization, and then from there, you and your host organization apply to EJW together. And then EJW then sends your application to all of the funders that they have, law firms, corporations, all that good stuff. So when I was in DC, I ended up meeting someone who works for the National Immigrant Justice Center here in Chicago, but she worked in their policy team in the DC office. And I asked her to go out for coffee. And yeah, she told me that they were looking for an EJW fellow, that the Chicago office was specifically, and not the DC office, which I was a little disheartened about because I was like, oh, policy, that'd be so great. But yeah, so I reached out to the Chicago office, and the federal litigation team of NIJC was looking for an EJW fellow. And then from there, lo and behold, one of an Iowa grad law school worked at NIJC, and it was kind of like the stars aligned for me, honestly, like that it worked out like that because yeah, just I don't know why the legal profession is like this, but a lot of it is networking, and a lot of it is who's gonna come up to bat for you. And luckily, one of the senior attorneys here at NIJC was an Iowa Law alum, and that connection was really helpful. And so I had an interview with NIJC first to see if they would accept me as being their EJW fellow, and like doing this whole application together. And then, so that was going into my 3L year. And I worked on my EJW application the first half of the fall semester of my 3L year. So this was fall 2019. And I treated the EJW application like as if I was taking another class in law school. Like, that's how serious I took it. I spent a lot of hours for probably all of August and September each week, refining the application and seeing what we could do to make it better, working with NIJC to get some, pull some data about, all of these clients who they have that are missing the kind of services that the fellowship would provide. So yeah, I literally took it as if it was another class in law school. That's how serious I took it. And yeah, applied. I got an interview with Greenberg pretty soon after I submitted the application, which was a huge relief to know that I had secured this before I went into the winter break. But I also had friends from Iowa who had their interviews in the spring. And so it yeah, like Brooke said, you'll know for sure by March. It was just a really huge relief for me to have it secured before the winter break, so I could, cruise into that last semester of law school really nicely. So yeah, that's my story of how I ended up where I am.
Thanks, Karla. I think it's interesting how you said you took it as serious as a class, the amount that it's almost like when you're applying for a job, they say, make that that's your job, is applying for a job. It's very similar. So that's a good attitude. Emily, let's hear more about your research and approach to developing and reaching out to an agency for this project.
Yeah, thanks. So I, before law school, was a middle school math teacher, and I loved teaching, but was really overwhelmed by all of the injustice I saw. Specifically, a big thing in the communities that I taught in were special education rights, and the fact that students were not receiving appropriate special education services. I was a general education teacher, but I taught inclusion classes, and a lot of times my students were not getting the support that they were supposed to. My mom had been a special education teacher throughout my whole life, so I was kind of aware of all of these different disability rights issues, but seeing it on the ground myself, and so many years after my mom had seen it, and recognizing that there were so many things that had not changed and were not changing in different communities, I really struggled with that. And I knew that long-term, I wasn't going to be the best asset to students in the classroom, but rather wanted to do something to help them outside of that, and to defend those rights. And so It's really why I went to law school, and I went to William & Mary because there's a special education advocacy clinic that you can get involved with during law school. So that's really why I went there. And similar to Karla, when she's talking about like the stars aligning, that's really what I feel like kind of happened with my situation too. So I reached out when I got to William & Mary and started the beginning of my 1L year. I reached out to the clinic director just to kind of talk. So 1Ls couldn't actually take the clinic class, but I wanted to get more information and see if there was any way I could get involved. And she ended up being an incredible mentor. And she's the one who really told me that fellowships existed. I didn't have any family members who were in the legal field at the time and really just didn't know. And so she kind of told me that information, and then also connected with me with eventually my host organization. So she had herself interned at Equip for Equality when she was in law school, and so had kind of raised that as a potential option. And I reached out, and next thing I knew, I was moving to Chicago. So I did my 1L summer here in the special education clinic at Equip for Equality. And even in my 1L summer, we kind of talked a little bit about fellowships and the potential of me applying. It was a little kind of vague at the time of like, this is a potential thing to look into. And so I had talked to them about, okay, if this is what I want to do, what's next, right? And so was told to reach back out at the beginning of my 2L summer to see if it would be an option and to kind of talk things through. Similarly, I was a little anxious about like putting all of my eggs in one basket and hoping that they would pick me. And so I interned somewhere else my 2L summer. I worked at the Education Law Center in Philly. And got a lot of incredible experience there. They did similar work, they did special education work, but they also worked on larger education issues and did a lot of systemic and impact litigation. So learned a lot from them. And it actually ended up, one of the attorneys that I had worked with at Equip for Equality had actually moved to Philadelphia and worked for the Education Law Center. So I got to work with her both summers. And she ended up being a really strong advocate for me when I went back to talking to EFE about doing a fellowship with them, and really helping advocate for me to get a project with them. And so I had reached out and we started talking and kind of informal talks about what this could look like, and why I wanted to be with them in the Chicago office. And so they decided that they did want to go forward with me. I actually applied for Equal Justice Works and Skadden with the same project. And really worked with them to develop that project. So I sat down and kind of thought through what topics I thought were interesting, what areas of the law I felt like I could really be helpful with, what projects fit me and my background, and then sat down with them and talked about, okay, well, what needs are they seeing and how do those things overlap? And how can I really meet what they're seeing? And that's where we came up with this transition issue, and recognizing that no one else in the state was doing it at the time, and really seeing that need. And so talked through that with them and was really thankful for their expertise and guiding me and in the application process, even with what to look for and how to figure out where to find these statistics and the things to back up what I had seen on the ground, and what they had been seeing as well. And really kind of worked through those things together, and was really appreciative of that. And I'll just say, when Karla's talking about how much time and dedication we put into these applications, I think, to be honest, as I reflect on my first year as a fellow, that helped so much because it meant that I had thought through exactly what I was doing and what I wanted this work to look like and what my goals were and how we were going to accomplish those things and what obstacles we might face. And thinking through all of those things has really helped me throughout my first year and make sure that this time has been meaningful, and we're making the most of the time in our fellowships. So I think that's a really big thing. And just using all of those resources, right? From my mentor at law school to the education, I had so many people who read my application and who talked through the project with me and talked through kind of troubleshooting any things that we had concerns about. So those relationships were a really, really big thing with this application process as well.
Perfect. So next we have a question from an attendee, McKenna Deutsch, who's our Pili intern at Ascend Justice. So McKenna, please ask your question.
Yeah, well, first, thank you guys all for coming and speaking with us. I had a question, I guess, for Brooke and Kathleen, and I was wondering if you guys see common mistakes on the application process that we should look out for to avoid.
Yeah, Brooke.
Sure, I'll start. And this is something to think about when you're filling out the application. There are a bunch, and what I can do, Brent, is send you like this in writing too, and you can always share it with everyone.
Sure.
One thing that I'll point out is that we have, like I said, so many different funders that are interested in looking at applications. And some of them are law firms, some of them are corporations, but all of them typically have lawyers or somebody at the organization that would like to get involved with your project. And so on our application, there's a pro bono opportunities section. And I think a common mistake is thinking that maybe that isn't as important as exactly what your project's going to look like and the layout and the plan and, you know, where you're going to be in 6 months and 1 year. Like that is all very important as well. But sometimes the person looking at your application, the most important thing to them is how they can, you know, share their resources with you, how they can get associates at their law firm to participate, to work on a pro bono case. So to really think about that and think about it with your host organization, because they might have some tips and tools on how they've brought in, you know, private attorneys or even other non-attorneys into their organization to help out, to really focus on that. And then another thing I'll just say is just logistically, when you're filling out our application, there are prompts that it's a form, essentially an online form at the end of the day. And we give you an amount of space to answer the question. Use the amount of space that we give you. Don't write less than that, because that is the amount of information we need for each question. And I think, you know, sticking to that and, you know, practicing how you're typing it out in a Word document or a shared document between your host organization for as long as you're working on it is a good place to keep it. But then once you copy and paste, make sure you're filling out the boxes. And I'll stop there, but again, I'll share some more with Brent so that you have them.
Those are super fascinating. McKenna, I will absolutely answer your question, but I also want to say the optimistic flip side of what wows us too, because I want you to have both. I would say pro tip, these PDF forms have lousy spell checkers, and you will not get a Skadden fellowship because you have typo, but you may get an embarrassing call from my colleagues. So, you know, that separate document tip, really helpful. But what I find is the essays will rarely have typos, but like last year, someone typed the host organization name wrong, because I'm sure they typed that straight in. And I was like, oh, that's, you know, 50 people looked at this, right? So embarrassing. But that time for extra eyes that aren't yours is really helpful. And I would say not just for typos, it's actually really helpful because the folks that are reading your EJW and the folks that are reading your Skadden, I'm a public interest generalist, right? Like I'm going to be evaluating projects that touch on areas of law in which I've practiced. And the advisory committee member might be on the board of an organization that's relevant or might not. And so especially for us in that first essay where you describe the project, which is 400 words, it's really important that you step back from your level of depth and expertise and make sure that that is really readable and explains what you're going to be doing and why it matters in a standalone way. It's a lawyering task to use the space that we are each giving you to tell us. And so it just, one, it takes time. It's hard to shoehorn it in really quickly. And then two, just freshen different perspectives, I think is really helpful. I'll just note that you're welcome to tell us if you think pro bono would be a part of your project. It is not a selection criteria or something that we'll necessarily talk about. Some projects make awesome use. Our person at NIJC, we have a fellow there right now too, has been like a high volume consumer of the firm's pro bono efforts, and that's a beautiful thing, but it's not something that we are looking for you to design around. So thank you.
Great. And if others have questions, let me know or turn on your camera, and we'll be happy to ask those to our panelists. So Karla and Emily, let's kind of flip that question to you both too. So do you have any tips that you remember from either the application or even the interview process, or even how this summer interns can use their experience and relationships working at the agency to develop a winning fellowship proposal? Karla, do we want to start with you again?
Sure. I think one of the things that was really helpful for my proposal, so I'm an immigrant. I was born in Mexico, naturalized by the time I was in high school. And so my personal story was inextricably tied to my project. And I know that's not the case for everyone. Like, not every applicant is going to be a part of the community that they intend to serve. But I think your background story, like as much as you can pull from your personal experiences and show how your personal experiences are going to benefit and serve your project, really tying that together is really helpful to your application. So I really encourage everyone to spend some time thinking about that as you're writing your application. And another thing, like, interestingly enough, because I knew, like, my personal experiences were so inextricably tied to my application, that I knew that wasn't enough to just say, like, oh, I've lived this, so I know that this is a need. You know, you want to be able to provide some data. So, like, don't hesitate to reach out to your host organization to ask them, like, hey, can you please pull reports from your internal data system that shows, you know, like, you have this percentage of your clients that need X service, and if it's like 75% of your clients that need the service, but only 2% of your clients end up receiving it, like, that's really helpful to show that your project is really fulfilling an unserved gap in services. And even if it's not data, I guess I'm just trying to be creative here. Even if you can't find data from your own host organization, like if they're a small organization or something that just doesn't have the management system to include that, like, ask them for copies of grant proposals that they've submitted, because it probably includes some sort of information like that. Or, you know, like going online to Westlaw to see if there's like some sort of amicus brief like that was filed at the Supreme Court that would supply that extra data. Like, it can be found, but you have to put in the work to find that information. For the interview process, something that I don't know if other people do this or not, but immigration law is really complicated. And especially once you get issues up at the district court or like the appellate level, because there are like different jurisdictional limits to what can be brought before a court. And so what I did for my interview process is I made little, what are they called? They're like the web charts where it's like something here and then there's like the line. I forgot what they're
like a flow chart?
Yeah, kind of like a flow chart. Yeah. I'm not, yeah, clearly I didn't do well in like math or like statistics. But even though those charts that I made weren't a part of my EJW application that I submitted to EJW, I made those and showed them to my interviewers at Greenberg Traurig to explain further and give them like a visual image of what it is that I was trying to do or like am doing now. And I don't know if other people, nobody told me to do that, but I thought it would be helpful and I guess it worked. So pro tip there. Yeah, I think, and this is something that Emily mentioned earlier, just really using your kind of like internal advocacy team, whether if that's at your law school or previous employers, even friends or colleagues within your own law school to read your application or read parts of your application, just to review and review and review, because you really want it to be as close to perfect as you can be. Because I mean, not only is getting the fellowship like a really awesome achievement, and like it's really hard to get these fellowships, it's also a stepping stone to where you could be in the future. Like for now, I would really love to be hired at NIJC after my fellowship ends. For whatever reason, if that's not possible, I know that I'll be able to move on to other things that are at the same, on the same platform or even higher based on this. So you really want to shoot for the moon when you're drafting this application.
And Emily, what about your experience with the application and any tips for that process?
Yeah, I think Karla touched on a lot of what I was thinking in my head. So I just have like a few other things and just wanted kind of to jump off of the like talking to a lot of different people, right? And having people read your application. One thing I found really valuable was having people read it who knew absolutely nothing about special education law. So most of my mentors in law school and like people that my host organization, obviously, and people that I had worked with were all very ingrained in this world. But having some people who were not familiar with those topics read through it and talk through the interview process with me was so helpful because it made me sit down and break down exactly what I was talking about in a way that was clear and concise and made sense, right? And then, you know, really, especially with the interview process, doing that with a number of different people with different backgrounds was really helpful and kind of talking through. And one thing that I really focused on when I was preparing for the interview process was thinking about, all right, what information do I want to make sure that Kathleen has before I walk out of this room? Like, what are the most important things that I want known about my project and about why I should be the person to do this before I leave? Because I didn't want to walk out and kick myself because I didn't say this one thing. And I think that was really helpful. And similar to what Karla mentioned, where she created kind of the diagrams or flowcharts, I made a one-pager that had kind of those basic facts and basic information about my project that I wanted to make sure, again, that they had when I walked out of that room. And so I think that was really helpful in kind of guiding me in my preparation for the interview process, and kind of also, you know, helped ground me a little bit with my nerves of like, okay, well, I know this information, I can explain it. I've done it a million times at this point, right? I've got this down. Not that it made it any less nerve-wracking, but helped a little bit, I will say. And I think, you know, Kathleen touched on this a little bit when she was talking about kind of what Skadden is looking for. But I think with both fellowships, one of the big thing when I was going through kind of creating my application and again, prepping for interviews is just focusing on that why you. Right. You know, Karla said a lot about her story and how she was inextricably linked with this work. And I think kind of we all are to an extent, right? And it's just figuring out what that looks like for you. And so taking the time to reflect on all of your experiences, personal and professional, whether it's things that made you realize like, oh no, don't want to do this, right? That still is informing what you're doing and what you're trying to, your project that you're pitching. So just really taking some time to think about that, to talk through that with people who know you, right? I had several people who I talked through this process with, and they're like, yeah, well, this makes sense. You've wanted to do this your whole life. And I was shocked by that because I had forgotten, right? And you get caught up in all these other pieces and then realize like, no, everything has led to this point. And I need to pull on all of those experiences that might seem tangential, right? But really have brought me here. So yeah, I mean, I think I've repeated myself a few times, but just really like using those relationships and the people who know you and support you and know this work as well are really my best pieces of advice.
Great. So I'm gonna pause here to see if anyone else here has a question, any of our audience. So if you do, chat or turn on your video, we'd love to hear from you.
Can I add one thing, Brent?
Please.
So these two humans are amazing. And I'm so glad that they're both in this work, and I can see why they were so successful in our processes. I wanted to flag just super logistically. So some of you probably already know an organization either that you're already partnering with or that you love because you interned there. And I would just say like Karla, like I didn't, and that's okay too. So we have folks who've interned at their organization that they apply with and folks that don't. I would just encourage you, if you're not already reaching out, like you have your afternoon assignment now. This is a great time, but you've got to get to it right away if you're not already in that process. Some big organizations have a really formal process like NIJC, where they're actually going to do this every year. Other little organizations may not sponsor a fellow at all unless you tell them about us and about Equal Justice Works. Both Equal Justice Works and us have resources for host organizations too. So just like we're doing a webinar, actually this afternoon, if you want to hear even more, I'm doing this again at 3 my time, 2 your time. But also we have one recorded on our website that was for host organizations, because we want them to be able to support you so that everyone can put their best foot forward. It's totally fine to be at a new organization. It may just mean that you're leaning a little bit more on whether it's your career services or your clinician or, you know, those other folks in your life. All of it's fine, but just do be really proactive, and it's not too late, but it's very much in process right now. So especially for the organizations that do sort of that formal posting, that's very much now. So get out there and reach out to folks.
Yes, one thing I've actually heard from interns after we have the seminar is that they feel like a little anxious that they're almost too late, and you're not too late. There's still plenty of time. Reach out to agencies. You know, don't feel discouraged by the amount of time that you have, but use this as the push that you need to reach out and talk to those agencies and start really thinking about a proposal. But Kathleen, go. Oh,
I just want to share, like, for example, I think I had my interview with NIJC like the first week of August of 2019, and immediately after is when, and I was also freaking out. I'm like, I've never worked at NIJC. The only connection I have is this Iowa alum who I have never heard of, but yeah, let's go. And so that, I mean, that's kind of what I mean when I said like the stars kind of aligned, but like I thought I was really late, and it worked out. So you're definitely not going to get it if you don't reach out.
Oh, Brent, can I add one
Please.
just plug for resources? I know Kathleen mentioned that on their website, they have everyone that's done the program and where they serve. Same thing with Equal Justice Works. We have a Meet the Fellows tab that you can press on. And so if you know your issue area, if you know what you want to work on, and you don't have that host organization in mind, you know, you can be a copycat. You can go and see where fellows have done this work before and see the organization. And it might be the first time you've heard of that organization, but it's a glimpse into what organizations do that type of work, and try to connect that way. And you can always reach out to me and say, I saw a fellow on your website or an alum on your website, and I'd love to connect with them to find out how I can possibly submit an application with that organization.
100%. The fellows community is a really great resource for you. And don't feel like it's the fellows from your law school or the fellows in your city, like really all of them. I would just say, I know that this feels scary, and you may feel like you have a lot less power in this search than the host organization, but I encourage you to really vet the host organization incredibly carefully, because for your clients, right, those clients that are your dream job, like, you want the supervisor who's doing the very best quality legal work that you can learn from. And you want the host organization that is just as committed to your clients and your project as you are. So even though, of course, you really want to secure a host, I really encourage you, to like push hard and ask everything you need to be confident that your clients are going to be well served. And then also to make sure that you do have this iterative back and forth dialogue that these two folks told you about, where you really do hone your insight about the need, about the clients that they serve, about how you can plug in and be useful. It just takes time.
So we actually have a perfect question in the chat that's aligned with what we're talking about right now. But a lot of what we're talking about today is, you know, there's networking, there's talking with people that, you know, you might not have thought would help you, or that it might be an organization that you'd be aligned with, and then it does perfectly align. And so I do want to plug that next week on Tuesday, Pili is hosting a virtual happy hour with an organization called First 10, which it connects new attorneys in the public interest law community with each other. So it's just a kind of networking group to help support public interest attorneys in the first 10 years of practice. And so it's a chance for you to talk with other public interest attorneys. Maybe there is an organization that you aren't familiar with, that you meet an attorney, or maybe they know of another organization that might be aligned with your interests. So I'll put that link in the chat, but just to plug that there's opportunities everywhere to network, and you know, one random thing could be what leads you to connect you to the fellowship organization that leads you to the fellowship. So but Joanne in the chat asked a really good question. Kathleen, let's go to you first and then Brooke for this. So how often do you award a fellowship to an agency that, to a host organization that hasn't previously hosted a fellow? How common is that?
Absolutely every year. For sure, multiple ones.
And Brooke, what about Equal Justice Works?
Yep, same. Every year we have new host organizations, and if even the number is low of new host organizations, it's probably not because we didn't pick new host organizations, it's because those applications didn't come in. So think about that. If you have a smaller organization that you're interested in applying with, we have the resources for them. We want new organizations, we want new people. So don't hesitate because of that reason.
And I almost think for an intern who, if you are later on in the process, it might be better to reach out to a new organization or a smaller organization that doesn't have as long of a process or does as elaborate of a process, and where you might be the only applicant that has asked about it, and they might be quicker to say yes, quicker to interview, and quicker to apply. Not always, but throwing out there, if you are someone who's like, wow, this sounds really interesting, but I feel like I'm, at step 1 and everyone else is at step 5.
Totally. I'll just flag there, just like with Brooke said, host organizations for us must be a 501c3. Just 2 small things to note. 1, they cannot be a project or clinic of a law school. They have to be their own nonprofit. And then the other thing that we have, because supervision is a big part of how we evaluate your application, we do have a hard and fast rule that your host organization must have 2 attorneys who are devoting their full time to civil legal advocacy. That is really so we make sure that you can be adequately supervised, but for us, that's a hard and fast rule in terms of their eligibility to apply. And if you had any questions about if your host or your project didn't meet our guidelines, if our website's not clear, that would be a reason for you and me to hop on the phone.
Great. Brooke, what about you for new agencies? Do you have any specifics?
No, a 501c3, and it can be a law school clinic. Your supervisor needs to be a lawyer, but no rule on how many lawyers need to be devoted to that issue area or advocacy in general. Yeah, one thing I didn't mention is that while we don't fund traditional criminal defense, we do fund criminal justice focused projects, but you can't be working at like a federal or state funded public defender. You can be working at a 501c3 public defender's office, like the Bronx Defenders.
That's 2.
So Kathleen, anything else that we haven't talked about that would help an applicant stand out in their application that you would want to mention?
Sure. I think one through line that you're hearing a lot of today is about insight. And people come to their insights all sorts of different ways. We have a welcoming statement where we specifically welcome applicants whose personal or professional experiences have yielded deep connection with the clients that they want to serve or insight into those clients' needs. And I think our fellows do come from an extraordinarily broad range of backgrounds, but they have done that thinking that Karla indicated is so critical about, is there the fit here between what your passion is and what your skill set is, where you know as much as possible as a starting attorney about what folks need and how to be of service, and then leveraging the strengths of an excellent host organization, right? What are they already committed to? Where are their skills? And then really designing a project that's achievable, that's feasible, right? That's going to be useful, and just thinking about that fit. And the fellows who stand out, right? They're extraordinarily insightful, and their insights come from all sorts of different places, but they did that thinking. Like the application takes some time to write, but both these applications, there's a lot more that you're hearing from all these guys about thinking too.
And Brooke, any final tips to stand out that you'd want to throw out there?
I think they've all said such outstanding things already. I guess the last one that I'll mention is that this is not a typical job application. I'm sure at this point in the presentation you realize that, but this is not something where you take a cover letter from another job you've applied for or an internship and try to repurpose it for your personal statement or for the essay that Kathleen was mentioning. You're starting from scratch and you're taking all of these very personal things about your connection to the work, whether you have a direct experience or not, with that, with the issues that you're going to confront, and just talking about it from a very unique perspective. why you, why this project, why right now, why this organization, and, you know, answering those questions from the get-go, not trying to repurpose anything that you've used before in the past for an application.
So Brooke, speaking of repurposing, there's actually a question in the chat that is not exactly this, I'm sure, but is similar, is, you know, if there are multiple organizations that maybe do similar work, what are your thoughts on applying with multiple organizations, or maybe not in the full process, but reaching out and talking to multiple organizations? Has that worked well before, or do you think it's better to focus on one organization?
My advice would be focus on several organizations. Be tactful about it. You know, if you are having conversations with one organization and you're getting really far in the process and you think you might, you know, choose them as your organization, or they might choose you, however that relationship is going, don't go too far in the process with another organization if you know that, you know, you've already have one in mind. But yeah, looking at different organizations and finding the best fit for you and making sure that your project and your, you know, career goals are aligned with what that organization does. It can't hurt to talk to several and hopefully find the one that is going to be the winning application with you.
And Kathleen, yeah, from Skadden's perspective, is
very
that the
good
same?
advice, right? Ultimately, you just apply with the one, but the conversations are really helpful. And to Brooke's point, it is a very small world. So you will get to know these people and interact with them throughout your legal career, and actually having those conversations about what it is they need and how you can be helpful. Those are actually excellent professional development conversations. It's not why you should apply, but it actually really is a very good part of the process. So definitely have those conversations with multiple orgs and ultimately settle on one to apply.
Perfect. So then, Emily and Karla, since we only have 8 minutes left, what are your plans for after the fellowship? And then any other recommendations for valuable resources, websites, or other things that have helped you either with the fellowship process or even in your career path and thinking about the next steps moving forward? Karla, let's go for you again. Sorry.
No, you're good. So my plans afterwards, well, hopefully NIJC decides to hire me. that's my first plan. And I guess I'm only in my first year of the fellowship, but once, I think I told my supervisor like a couple of months of being here that I'm like, yep, just letting you know now, I want to stay if you guys will have me. And their responses so far have been like, yeah, for sure, if we have the funding, which is a huge problem in the nonprofit world, but it's a reality. So I think for me, like in my 6-month reports like that I have to submit for EJW, and then with my performance evaluations internally at NIJC, I've always reiterated my desire to stay at NIJC to my supervisor. And I don't know, I don't know if I'm just being like too eager about it, but I'm just gonna lay out all my cards on the table and see how it goes. I've heard other fellows advise like, well, you probably don't really want to say anything until your second year because you still have a bunch of time left in your fellowship. But I'm like, this is great. I want to stay here for some time. So, and another thing about, wanting to expressing my desire to stay here. And this is something that EJW has you think about when in your application is how you're going to make your project sustainable, regardless of whether you stay with the organization or not. And that's something that I've tried really hard to focus on as, since I started my fellowship, is how can I make the work that I'm doing for NIJC exist and stay in its place after the 2 years are up, so that when the 2 years are up, I'm like, hey, you guys still have a bunch of clients. The clients just keep coming. You need someone to keep doing this work. I've already been doing it for 2 years. I am really beneficial to the organization and I have a lot to offer. please hire me, in like a much more eloquent way, right? And as far as, yeah, I mean, if for whatever reason it doesn't work that I stay at NIJC, something else that I've also been doing is just asking my colleagues out to coffee, even if like some of them are in DC, so it's like virtual stuff. We have other colleagues in San Diego, but even just making those connections with colleagues, because if for whatever reason it doesn't work out that I can't stay at NIJC, I also want to leave here with good connections, so that someone, I can reach out to someone and say like, hey, can you write me a letter of recommendation? So you just want to make sure that you're a nice person and doing good work while you're finishing out your fellowship.
Exactly. And I think you touched on something in legal aid, which is why fellowships are such a great opportunity. Is like, I don't really know if I can think of another opportunity where you're going to have guaranteed funding for 2 years right out of law school. That most legal aid wants, it's mostly after you get your bar results back that there's really a lot of applying and interview processes. So I think you touched on what, I can't remember if we mentioned it before, but that's really why this is such a great opportunity. It's so Emily, what's the last words from you? What, if you have any plans? I know you're only 1 year in, but and then any other last minute advice or tips that you have for folks as they follow this path?
Yeah, so similar to Karla, I would like to stay at my organization, and started having that conversation really early too. I was thankful because I had interned, I really had an idea of what it was going to look like already. So kind of knew going in that like, if this is a possibility to stay, really want this to happen. And have thankfully had kind of some check-in conversations with my supervisor where we talk about those things, right? What does this look like? How to make the project sustainable, like Karla was saying, but also thinking about like, okay, well, how do we figure out sustainable funding then? Are there certain grants that we should be looking into? Is there certain data that I should be collecting on my project already to be able to share with potential funders in the future? And having some of those conversations, and that is helpful. I, similar to Karla, had gotten some of that same advice of like, well, you don't need to worry about it yet. Don't need to have those conversations in your first year. But I'm thankful I have, because I have been able to start thinking about those things and thinking about ways to make this, the project continue, and also me be able to continue doing this work for this organization with funding, which is so crucial, as we all know. And so I think that's been really important, and I hope to be able to continue doing this work here, but if not, hopefully can find, I know there's a big need kind of all over the place for this. So hopefully can continue doing this work. I'd say, last kind of piece of advice, I know it's already been mentioned, but I just want to reiterate, talking to fellows. The network is incredible. I was so thankful. I talked to Skadden fellows, and Kathleen really helped me get connected with people that were doing similar work or who had fellowships that were similar to the kind of project that I wanted to do, who were really helpful, not just talking about the process of application, but also to hear how their work has evolved. And that was really helpful for me. And I also had the opportunity to talk to a number of Equal Justice Works fellows, and really learn from a variety of people who do this work. And I will say, I contacted a lot of people, and out of everyone I talked to, they were all welcoming and eager to talk. And I am the same way now as a fellow. So if anybody wants to follow up, I'll put my contact information in the chat as well. If people want to talk, I'm happy to and help in any way that I can.
Thanks. So Kathleen, do you have any last piece of advice for folks, either about Skadden Fellowships or anything like that you heard in law school or wish that you had heard in law school that you want to pass on?
Wow, that's so much. I would say being a public interest student, you already know this, but you really have to chart your own path. And fellowships are one opportunity. It is not all that often that you are asked what it is that's like your true purpose and your dream job. And so I encourage you to grab that opportunity. I think it's a really useful consideration. And do watch the info session that EJW does, where they go through all the details. Watch mine. Really get those details down so that you don't have to worry about them, because the most important thing is your vision and your purpose and why it is that you're doing what you're doing. So thank you. I'm looking forward to talking to you all individually and reading your applications.
And Brooke, you get the last word. What about any last piece of advice for folks that you wish that you heard in law school?
Likewise, talk to everyone that you can. Know that it's a very supportive community. The legal nonprofit world it's just a lot of good people who want to help others. So know that you're supported. Know that people want to hear from you. I'm always looking forward to talking to law students. And in terms of the application process itself, we also want you to succeed. That's why we offer so many resources. That's why we're so welcoming. We're like, call us, email us. We want to help you, and so do fellows and alum of both programs.
Well, thank you, Kathleen, Brooke, Emily, and Karla for joining us today to talk about Pili Fellowships. And thank you everyone for joining us. Again, just to plug, next week on Tuesday, we have that First 10 happy hour. You can visit our website to sign up, or I put the link in the chat. And then we'll be back on Thursday for another educational seminar. Next week is about advocating for LGBTQ plus clients. So I hope you'll be back on Thursday for that discussion. So thank you, everyone. Good to see you. And again, thank you, Kathleen, Brooke, Emily, and Karla.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks so much, Brent.
Thank you.
Thank you.